Conviction by Aaron Alston saw the return of two characters that we hadn't seen since the end of the Legacy of the Force books. One of those characters should not have been a surprise to anyone who saw the back cover of the hardcover edition, but the other one may have been. Tenel Ka, Alana's mother and the Queen Mother of Hapes, appears in like the last third of the book when Han and Leia are dispatched to Klaatuine to assist with the negotiations between these different freedom fighter groups. And Boba Fett, leader of the Mandalorians and bounty hunter extraordinaire, shows up likewise in the latter third of the novel to rescue someone from prison. Who could that person be? Conviction by Aaron Alston ultimately made it to number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list for the week of June 12th, 2011, and was ultimately on the list for 2 weeks. All I really guessed going into Conviction that this would finally be the book with the conclusion of Tahiri Vela's long-running criminal trial, and that Luke and Ben and Vestara would be once again chasing off after Abeloth. So, a brief summary. While the Jedi plan to remove Chief of State Daala from power, Tahiri Vela's trial rushes towards its conclusion, and the Jedi may not be able to save Tahiri from her fate. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker, his son Ben, and the Sith apprentice Vestara Khai follow Abeloth to the world of Nam Chorios. A dangerous world where any use of the Force has immediate, dangerous repercussions. So to avoid sounding like a broken record with the subplots that were in the previous book continue in this book, I'll just talk about the plots going on. At the end of Vortex, I said, oh, it's so great that the Jedi are supporting Luke now, and now he'll have their aid in going against Abeloth. Well, sort of. Not for most of the book, at least. Most of the book is just Luke and Ben and Vestara on Nam Chorios, trying to figure out where Abeloth is, being sabotaged every step of the way, finally forcing a confrontation with her, but they're not able to kill her. They wound her and she escapes, and they're able to get out just in the nick of time before the Sith presumably would have killed them. The Jedi wake up the Horn siblings at the beginning of the novel, and the Horn siblings, maybe because they were still frozen in carbonite when all the other Jedi were released from their madness, are still mad. And so they connive a way to escape Coruscant and Jedi supervision. They bring a journalist along with them to Nam Chorios, where they are definitely working under Abeloth's sway, but it seems as though Luke and then Vestara wounding Abeloth in the end breaks them of their madness, and the Skywalkers are going to be taking the Horn siblings back to the rest of the Jedi. The Sith are definitely hunting for Vestara, especially after she killed Lord Talon, although she does somewhat lure them to Nam Chorios, knowing that the Skywalkers and her cannot face Abeloth on their own. They're definitely not working on the same side as the Skywalkers anymore, other than Vestara. The Jedi plan and plan and plan, and then finally carry out a coup against Daala's government, but more specifically against Daala herself. They lock down the Senate building, they get in, they incapacitate Daala, and now Saba Sabatine is one of a triumvirate of leaders ruling the Galactic Alliance until they're able to elect a new chief of state. However, the Jedi remain pretty much unaware of that pro-Imperial conspiracy that was going on behind the scenes, although they at least have an inkling that something is going on, even if they haven't rooted out that conspiracy really at all, and in fact have installed 2 of its leaders as 2 of the heads of the triumvirate at this time. With that settled, the Jedi send Han and Leia and some other Jedi later on to Klaatuine to try to come to an accord with these different freedom fighter groups. This is when Tenel Ka comes into the story, and there's a nice reunion between Tenel Ka and Alana. Also pulls some other Sith into the story who want to kill Tenel Ka because of her suspected connection to the Jedi Queen that Lord Talon saw in that font of knowledge on Abeloth's planet. And Tahiri Vela's trial finally reaches its conclusion. The Jedi overthrowing Daala actually works against her with the jury, and she is found guilty and sentenced to death. Her defense lawyer, Boatu, is like, we'll appeal this, we'll try to get, something happening. But when Boba Fett shows up to break Daala out of the same prison that Tahiri's in, Tahiri takes this as an opportunity to escape. And as the book ends, she's hiding out. She's hoping that the Solos will return soon so she can search out her friends and try to get some help. And that means that Daala is also on the loose, also thinks that she needs to come back and take back over the Galactic Alliance and get things back where they need to be. So, got 2 runaway felons left dangling for the next book. So Tahiri's on the cover. Let's talk about Tahiri first. I feel like Tahiri's trial was basically a lose-lose situation. Obviously, Boatu was trying to present the fact that she was manipulated into her actions by a Sith Lord, but you can't really get over the fact that she did murder an old man, and they have audio footage of this. So the guilty verdict was not really a surprise to me, but I feel like the death sentence was. Maybe because it seems like every time someone commits some heinous act in Star Wars, they always get away scotch-free. I'm looking at you, Kype Durin. I'm looking at you, Kype Durin. Once the prison breakout for Daala began, I was like, oh yeah, she's gonna get out because, she's gonna take the opportunity and grab it. She's given up on the legal system at this point. She's gonna be a fugitive. Like, that makes sense to me. I'm not sure that Tahiri's trial need to be dragged out over 3 books, though. I just think of books like the Krytos Trap in the X-Wing series, which had the trial of Tycho Chelchu in 1 book, and I really think that keeping it to 1 book makes it more thrilling and more impactful to the reader, and when you start to drag it out across multiple books, it's almost like I lose interest in the outcome of the trial, and in fact start to have that feeling I had where it's like, well, she might be convicted, but nothing's gonna come of it because nothing ever comes of it. I guess a guilty verdict surprised me. I was glad for that, but I do think that 3 books plus, more books on top of that before the trial even started is maybe too many books to focus on Tahiri's trial here. We have another Jedi arrested in the form of Seha Dorvald, who was first introduced as the Jedi apprentice of Octaramus, but she's now graduated. She's a Jedi Knight. Good for Seha. And she helps get the Jedi on Coruscant into the Senate building, who are going to be carrying out this coup against Daala. And then the pro-Imperial conspiracy frames her, said that she tried to poison people, and she didn't, but political diplomatic reasons, she turns herself in. And so the Jedi coup means that Seha gets off scotch-free. Tahiri unfortunately doesn't. And Seha's adamant denial that she poisoned anyone leads one of the characters, a new character I think, because I don't remember seeing him up to now, who was a member of Galactic Alliance security, to start to question, wait a minute, who did that poisoning benefit and why? Which I like that someone is starting to think in the right direction, and towards the end, Saba 17 as well is starting to think in the right direction. But oh man, I guess it just frustrates me when there's this really obvious conspiracy to me, the reader, maybe not obvious to the characters within the book, and I'm like, don't you see what they're doing? And they don't. Speaking of the Jedi, they obviously carry out that coup attempt against Daala. They get a bunch of Jedi, get them into the Senate building, get them in position, get stuff programmed into the security so that they will think that there's a Yuuzhan Vald attack and everything will shut down. And then they're able to get in, they're able to stun Daala, they're able to talk to leaders and say like, hey, Daala's out of power, what's happening next? I have some other thoughts about this that I will save for the issue section, though. I will just briefly say that I think this was possibly a mistake on the Jedi's part and has not put them into a better position. I mean, obviously a better position in that they don't have Daala antagonizing them, but that pro-Imperial conspiracies just lurking right there, lurking with all the power. We'll circle back around to that. And the rest of the Jedi want to help Luke, don't really know where Luke is for most of the book, run around and do other things like getting freedom fighters to agree to terms with the Galactic Alliance, returning Booster Tarek's hostages to Galactic Alliance custody, stuff like that. And they do show up at the end at Nam Chorios attacking the Sith forces there. But if I said at the end of the previous book, I'm so glad the Jedi are helping Luke now, that doesn't happen for most of the book. It's definitely Luke on his own. The Fate of the Jedi series, to me, definitely seems like the authors are making an active attempt to revisit some of these Bantam era worlds that we haven't seen in a while, which I appreciate. You know, we saw Dathomir, we saw the monks who we barely saw in the Hand of Thrawn duology. And then we went back to Almania, specifically to the moon of Pyder, and now we're here on Nam Chorios, which we were introduced to in Planet of Twilight by Barbara Hambly, and it is a cold, creepy, gothic, vampire-esque world. I think that Hambly is very talented at creating atmosphere and settings, and Nam Chorios definitely stuck with me from Planet of Twilight, so I was really glad to revisit it here. Although I wish there had been more with the Oldtimers and the Theran Listeners, because I found them very interesting. Like with a lot of what's happened in Fate of the Jedi, the chance to visit these other Force traditions is something that I was very much looking forward to, and I just wish there had been more of them here. We basically see them. We first meet Tasselda, the centuries-old Jedi, who is better now, healed now, working with the Theran Listeners. Through her, Luke learns this method of memnotherapy. But then the Theran Listeners fall under Abeloth's sway. They're sabotaging stuff that the Skywalkers and Vestara are doing, and a lot of it is investigative stuff, but every time they investigate something, they get ambushed. Yeah, and I would have liked to see more of them working with the people of Nam Chorios, but for plot reasons, they obviously can't. But Conviction finally gave us an ending for Callista, a bittersweet but a deserved ending for her. I had a deleted scene short from the previous one where I just said, you know, what happened to Callista makes me so sad. This doesn't change anything what happened to her, but using that memnotherapy, Luke is able to detach Callista's spirit from Abeloth and let her pass on to the light side and finally find some peace. In a classic Callista move, she doesn't say anything, she's just gone, but you know, that was how they parted ways at the end of Planet of Twilight. Didn't say a word to each other, just looked at each other and were like, bye. So I guess it's fitting. And I finally, I think, got a little bit better of a timeline of when Callista got subsumed by Abeloth. It seems to have been before the Jedi younglings were sent to the shelter in the Maw, because it seems to be implied that part of the reason that Abeloth reached out to them was because of that part of Callista she had within her. I'm not sure about that. I think Abeloth would have reached out to any Force users that she sensed, thus how she had that hold over the Mindwalkers, who were made up of, you know, so many different Force traditions. But I think it really reiterates that Callista's been gone for a while, and that this was the kindest end she could have had, and that Luke did this out of that love and regret he had for their relationship that failed. And Vestara is questioning her upbringing, questioning elements of her Sith culture. She writes these diary entries to her father, talking to him almost though he were a dad like Luke Skywalker, but realizing that he's not. This was a little bit where I felt like in Omen, I thought the Khais did have a loving family relationship, but here, and in fact, in the previous few books, it seemed to be that Gavar is very ambitious for his child. He will push his child to do things that a truly loving dad probably wouldn't. And I think that Vestara realizes that here in trying to write these diary entries that, hey, my upbringing was different than Ben's. My dad is different than Ben's. Am I lacking something here? Did I miss out on something here? I do think, though, that Vestara being redeemed is definitely going to be some sort of slow burn event. I don't think it's going to happen by the end of the Fate of the Jedi series. I think that even if Vestara stopped being a Sith, she still has this ruthless trait that comes through in her willingness to kill the Sil crystal to incapacitate Abeloth and the other Sith and let them escape. And I don't think that's something that a Jedi would ever do. A Jedi would be like, this crystal is a sentient creature. I'm not willing to kill it for a distraction, basically. But Vestara has a much more strategic mind, and she basically took a crystal and held on to it for a while, saying like, well, last resort, I'll use this. And then she does. And Luke's like, Vestara, that wasn't great. And she's like, yeah, but it worked. And you know what? It did work. But also, Vestara, it's a little worried that you would do that. So my first issue with Conviction was just a continuation of those editing errors that I've seen popping up in the last few books that surprised me and made me wonder if, maybe they were rushing a little bit too much with the Fate of the Jedi series. Like, the events of the last book, Vortex, took place on the moon of Pyder, but Conviction consistently says it took place on Almania. We meet Tasselda again, who's this centuries-old Jedi who fell to the dark side on Nam Chorios and has now been redeemed. However, her name is spelled Tasselda instead of Tasselda, but this is not super noticeable because she's now going by the name of Sel, so we don't really see her full name an awful lot. And then during that Jedi coup in the Senate building, Corran's blade is described as, giving off purple light, but Corran very famously has a silver lightsaber. So just little stuff like that, where I'm just really surprised the editors didn't catch this before it went to print. And then especially in between, the hardcover printing and the paperback printing, why didn't you fix this stuff? A bigger issue I found with Conviction was just the existence of this Jedi coup plotline. On the one hand, it feels very meant to harken back to the prequels because that was 100% what the Jedi Council was prepared to do. They are like, oh, Palpatine's a Sith Lord? We will confront him. We will remove him from power, but Palpatine's a Sith Lord, so he kills them all. So it did feel somewhat here like, we want to do an ode to the prequels. We're going to have them sneak their way into the Galactic Alliance Senate building, and they're going to get Daala out of power and then talk to the senators. And won't this be fun? It will be like what the prequel Jedi were trying to carry out but failed at. But my first problem is we've already seen this before. In the Legacy of the Force books, we had a corrupt Sith Lord head of state in the form of Jacen Solo, and the Jedi overthrew him from power, and we're apparently fine with Daala being voted in as chief of state at that time. So we've already done Jedi coups before. It's not super novel. And my second and biggest problem with it is just that I feel like it creates very dangerous precedent in the Star Wars galaxy. All the way back to the Bantamera books where Luke petitioned the New Republic to start his new Jedi Order, I wasn't crazy about the Jedi being so connected to New Republic and then Galactic Alliance politics. That was one of my big issues with Destiny's Way, where they directly intervened in the election of a leader, and then not just that, but we're fine with having the Jedi Council consist of people who weren't Jedi. Obviously, the Jedi need money to support their mission, and they get that money from the government, but then you run the issue of the government wants to use you like soldiers, harkening back to the Clone Wars, and we know how that turned out bad. Then we have instances of the government being like, well, you should do this, and you should do that, and you should do this, and then all the way down to Daala being like, I don't like how you're behaving, I want to change all these aspects of your institution. And I think a lot of that could have been solved if the Jedi were completely removed from politics, which may have been a pipe dream, but it's my pipe dream. So I just think that having a triumvirate, which includes a Jedi Master, is not a good track to take, and I don't think is going to lead to better sentiments about the Jedi in the galaxy. And I think that's something that pro-Imperial conspiracy really is going to exploit. So hopefully the Jedi and, you know, the good Galactic Alliance people uncover them and stop them, because I don't see this turning out well for the Jedi. I could be wrong. Maybe everything will be hunky-dory and it will be sunshine and lollipops, but I just don't think this was a good path to take. I think there are evils much worse than Daala. Yeah, I'm not crazy about this, and it was a big chunk of the book. I will say, at least I had wondered why not put Leia in charge, because Leia was a chief of state. Leia has all this diplomatic experience, and they explain it as if they had done that, then people would think that the Jedi wanted to permanently remain in charge. And so with having Saba be one of the triumvirate heads, people know, oh, this is just a temporary thing because, you know, she's not a politician, she's not trained for this, she doesn't have the knowledge for this. This is just until we can elect a new chief of state. My third issue with Conviction is less an issue with Conviction as a whole and more with the Fate of the Jedi books. Now that I'm coming to the tail end of the series, the beginning of that third trilogy, compared to the Legacy of the Force books, I feel like there's not enough plot in Fate of the Jedi to sustain 9 books. And I think we see that play out in Tahiri Vela's trial, dragging out across multiple books. We see that play out in the fact that Luke and Ben have been chasing after Abeloth for multiple books. Obviously, Legacy of the Force as a 9-book series was a success, but Legacy of the Force had this sense of urgency that kept you reading from book to book to book. But in Fate of the Jedi, it just feels like there's not enough plot to sustain this many books. And I think the introduction of the slave uprising plot lines out of nowhere in book 5 is a symptom of that, where it's like, oh, we need more plot. We need people to sympathize with the Jedi more. The slave uprisings. And so I think that if Fate of the Jedi had been condensed down to a trilogy or even down to 2 trilogies, it would have benefited the books a lot more, because even now, coming into the conclusion of the series, I just don't feel that sense of importance and being propelled from event to event to event, where you're watching Jason fall apart and you're horrified by it, but you can't stop reading. There's not that same sense here. I think that maybe in making Abeloth the overarching villain, and she's this nebulous, Lovecraftian dark side force, doesn't help, because yeah, she's bad. Oh boy, she could threaten things. But so far, she's just threatened, like, individual Force traditions, and that's it. So, in short, Conviction finally gives us a conclusion to Tahiri Vela's trial, as well as to that terrible situation between Daala and the Jedi. There's still that pro-Imperial conspiracy lurking in the wings to deal with, but hey, they got rid of one of the big bads at least. I liked returning to Nam Chorios because I found it so interesting and atmospheric in Planet of Twilight. I just wish we could have seen more of the Oldtimers and the Theran Listeners and their Force tradition instead of pretty early on in the story they fall under the sway of Abeloth, and Luke and Ben and Vestara are hindered every step of the way. I do think that this Jedi coup is setting a dangerous precedent for everything. I would not have gone that route. So next time, I'm going to be reading the penultimate, 8th book in the Fate of the Jedi series, Ascension by Christie Golden.